It's a great it's a great honor to be here in Hanoch, in Maor, Israel, and I'm really, really appreciative for you all for coming this evening. I really would like to thank the Abenson family, it's patients of mine, who got me in touch with Eli Klein, the Gabba. Thank you so much for giving us this wonderful venue, Michael Brush, and we have a very special evening tonight. When I first heard about this book, The Mirrer in Manila, I was very fortunate that I got a copy, and I couldn't put it down. It's an exceptionally special book. It tells the story of about his father, Shmuel Chaim, who was in Kamenetz, and then Alchanan Wasserman, and then he went to the Mirrer, and from the Mirrer, he'll explain it to you. They went to Shanghai, and Japan, Shanghai. He explains in the book the whole history about Sugihara, the Curacao visas, what happened in Shanghai. It's absolutely unbelievable to read. It took Dr. Soroka 20 years to write this book. And as I said this afternoon, we were in Osamer, each page is a gem. Each page is a masterpiece. You'll be living Jewish history when you read the book. So it's out of print at the moment, but Bezrat Hashem, there'll be more printings because it should be translated into many languages. It is really something, it's a gift to Am Yisrael, it's our history, and it's such a zchut to have the author, Dr. Soroka, who's going to give us a lovely presentation tonight about this incredible story, this true story of his father. So thank you once again for having us this evening, and I want to thank the whole Kehillah for inviting us here in Hanoch.
First of all, I'd like to thank Dr. Glassman for inviting me. I'd like to begin by saying that this presentation is really Leilu Nishmas, my father, whose yahrzeit was just 2 days ago. It's interesting that the story itself is a story of, someone said it's Aleph Beis Gimel, Emunah, B'tochen, and Geula. And similarly, in terms of my father's experience, his taka was a story of his Emunah, his B'tochen, and eventually his Geula. My father was born in Kamenetz, in Poland. He learned in Kamenetz, he learned in Baranovich. He learned in Mirrer Yeshiva. And the Mirrer Yeshiva fled the town of Mir. They went to Vilna, Kovno. Baruch Hashem, they were able to escape. They were the only yeshiva that escaped intact. They went through Moscow, Kobe, Japan, Shanghai, China, and whereas the entire yeshiva was in Shanghai, China for the rest of the war, my father's journey was a little delayed, and he in fact was stuck in Manila in a prisoner of war camp by the Japanese for 3.5 years. The 1930s and 1940s was an era, time where there was many complex historical events that were happening. But if we take a look at the entire picture of what happened, how the yeshiva was saved, how my father was saved, it's a lesson in terms of Hashkapas Praktius, the Nixim and the place that happened in terms of his rescue and survival is something that we could all learn from. As many, or all European Jewry during this period, everyone was trying to find a means of escape. Everyone was trying to find out what countries would allow them to enter. And we'll see that there were so many obstacles that were set up not only by governments that we know that were not friendly to Jews, Germans, Japan, but also the American government itself was responsible for preventing Yidden from leaving Europe And whereas hundreds of thousands, millions of Yidden could have been saved, unfortunately, there were barriers and obstacles that were set up that prevented him from escaping. We're not familiar, but in those days there were many restrictive immigration laws. Certainly there was anti-Semitism, there was indifference by governments, by state officials, but despite all the obstacles, there were Yechidim that were out there who in fact were instrumental in saving Yidden throughout the war. This just shows you that immigration to the United States prior to the war, but the couple years right before the war and during the war, immigration dropped to almost nothing, and it's really a condemnation of the American government, where it did not allow Yidden to come to America. The British prevented Jews from entering then what was called Palestine, whereas people could have been saved, they weren't. But this story is a story of just 300 Talmidim and the Rebbeim from the Mirrer Yeshiva who in fact were saved. You know that HaKadosh Baruch Hu always prepares a refuah before the Makkah, and it's so apparent in terms of this story where the refuah was prepared by the HaKadosh Baruch Hu before the Makkah. In terms of my father, he had an uncle who came to America in 1907, and he was instrumental in terms of 30 years later helping my father obtain a visa to come to America. He in fact left Russia because he wanted to avoid being put into the Tsar's army, came to America, and he was instrumental in terms of the Yeshua of my father. Whereas Yechidim helped to save the Jews of Europe, the State Department, governments worked just the opposite. We'll see that this is the story of Sugahara, a Japanese diplomat, Rabbi Avram Kalmanovitz from the Mirrer Yeshiva, who in fact spearheaded rescue efforts for the members of the yeshiva. Zerach Haftig, who also was involved in terms of the rescue of Polish refugees during this period. Most people are familiar about the concentration camps in Poland, Germany. Very few people realize that besides those concentration camps where Yidden were killed, there were extermination camps, there were other camps during the war that many people died, many people went through Yisurim, and these were the prison camps of the Japanese within the Far East. My father was put into two different camps during this period. One was called Santo Thomas Internment Camp, and the other one was called Las Baños Internment Camp. During this period, the Japanese, when they invaded the Philippines, there was the famous Bataan Death March. Tens of thousands of Filipinos, tens of thousands of Americans were in fact killed by the Japanese during this period. There's a distinct difference between the concentration camps during the Holocaust in Europe as compared to the ones in the Far East. In Europe, the intent was to exterminate Jews. In the Philippines, in the Far East, it was not directed toward Jews. It was directed to anyone who was enemies of the Japanese government. This is my father's father. When the yeshiva was about to flee from Europe, my father's father, who was a Melamed in Communist Yeshiva, wrote a letter to my father, gave it to him, and told him that he's pleased that my father is within the yeshiva. He tells him to listen to your Rebbeim, and he's hopeful that he would have a Yeshua with the yeshiva. My father started from Kamenetz, where he was born, Baranovich, who was a Talmud of Rebbe Chanan. From there, he went to Mirrer Yeshiva. Mirrer Yeshiva, we'll see later on, fled to the Vilna and Kovno. Then they had to leave Kovno and they had to go to Kedanya. And from there, they eventually went through Europe to Shanghai, China. Unfortunately, as we see how the yeshiva fled all the places where they came from, Kamenetz, town of Kamenetz, everyone was killed. As a matter of fact, my father never knew what happened to his father and his family. It was only about 3 years ago that I found out exactly how my father's father, my grandfather, was killed. There was a book that was written in Russian, which was translated, and it talks about Rabbi Yosef Soroka, my father's father, how he was massacred by the Nazis when they came into Kamenetz. People were sent to ghettos, people were sent to some concentration camps, but wherever they went, Kamenetz, Mir, Kedanya, Kovno, they were all killed by the Nazis. It's interesting to see how Hashem organized or orchestrated the survival of the yeshiva. Vilna was a city that was sometimes historically was part of Poland, sometimes it was part of Lithuania. Even Russia took over Vilna at one point in time, but during 1938, Poland, which was stronger than Lithuania, forced the government of Lithuania to build a railway between Kovno and Vilna. And this is very crucial because that railroad enabled the yeshiva boys to get documents in Kovno, which enabled them to escape. It's interesting that we have two totalitarian governments, dictatorships, Russia and Germany, which were certainly not friendly to one another, but all of a sudden, in 1939, they had a treaty between both governments, in which they said they won't attack each other, but they also said that they divided Poland into two. And the east part of Poland was taken over by Russia, the western part of Poland was taken by Germany, and the Polish Jewry were in a vise because wherever they turned, it's either being under the Russians or under the Germans, and both of those governments were totally against Jewry. In any case, right after they had this treaty, Russia took over part of Poland, and the other part of Poland was taken by Germany. Knowing that they had no means of escaping, the yeshiva left the town of Mir. Unfortunately, the town of Mir was in fact destroyed. All the Jews that were left in Mir were killed, but the Mirrer Yeshiva fled and they went to Vilna. Now, part of that treaty between Russia and Germany was such that no one understands why they took Vilna and they said Vilna should go back to Lithuania and should be independent. This enabled many Jews to escape from Poland and go to Vilna. All right, Vilna and Kovno were the only two cities that were not controlled by either the Germans or the Russians. Later on, Russia took over Vilna, but there was a several weeks period where Jews could run to Vilna and they were safe from all factions. Mirrer Yeshiva left, but the city of Mir was totally captured by the Nazis, and everyone were either killed, sent to a ghetto, or eventually sent to concentration camps. But during this period, 15,000 Jews were able to escape and enter Vilna. As a matter of fact, it was so many refugees in Vilna, and eventually the government in Vilna said Jews have to leave. Some yeshivas went to Kedanya, like my father, and others went to other outlying areas from Vilna. During this period, the Vadat Salam, which was established by Avram Kalmanovitz, the American Joint Distribution Committee, also provided food and shelter for all the refugees in Vilna. Now, the reason why I'm skipping a lot is because there's a lot of material, and I don't want to burden the oilam over here, because if I would go through everything, we would be here for the next couple of hours. So to just try to make it manageable, I'm going through a lot of slides very, very quickly. In any case, within independent Lithuania, some 15,000 Jews found temporary refuge and as a haven. Ultimately, Kovno, ultimately Vilna were destroyed by the Nazis, and all the Jews that remained there were in fact killed. And unfortunately, as most of European Jewish communities, they became Judenrein. Now, the obstacles that refugees faced was, number one, they had to have some documents showing that they were citizens of some country. Many of the Mirrer Yeshiva students did not have such documents. They didn't have passports. They didn't have any papers. Many of the communities where they came from, they were unable to get those documents. So they were missing a crucial piece of information showing that they were a citizen of a country. Now, to leave a country, you have to have a visa to allow you to enter another country. That was a major problem because all countries did not want to accept Jews. America, Great Britain, and certainly wouldn't want to go back to another European country. So to get an entry visa was a crucial problem that was faced by those who were trying to flee Europe. More than that, even if you had a visa to go to another country, you have to have permission to travel from where you are to that country, and countries will be willing to give you a travel permit to leave one country and travel to their country. And most importantly, once Russia took over Lithuania, once Russia took over Vilna, Russia told the people there that we want you to become citizens of Russia. And if you didn't want to become a citizen, that means you are saying that you don't believe in Mother Russia, all right? And there was the possibility that if you denied obtaining Russian citizenship, they would send you to Siberia. So many people were reluctant to ask for permission to leave either Poland or Lithuania. In any case, what happened was, since few people had passports or identifying papers, now that there was a railway between Kovno and Vilna, two Bachrim from the yeshiva went to Kovno, which had an embassy. The Polish government, since Poland was no longer in existence, it was taken over by Germany and by Russia, but the Polish government was a Polish government in exile that operated through the British embassy in Kovno, and the Polish government in exile was willing to give 300 people papers indicating that these are Polish citizens, even though the Polish government in exile was not recognized by anybody, well, certainly not by Germany, and by Russia, they were able to give these documents to the students of the yeshiva. Well, what happened was everyone knew that the documents that they had were very questionable. They weren't really valid passports. Here's my father, his certificate from yeshiva, as well as his papers showing that he was a Polish citizen. To get an entry visa, you had to have a transit visa. To get a transit visa, you had to show that you were allowed to go into another country. It was a vicious cycle because you had to have all the documents, all the certificates at the same time. Russia, once they took over Vilna and Lithuania, they were closing down the embassies. They were closing down all means where people could get these papers. There was a very small window where people could obtain these certificates. Part of the puzzle was, which enabled them to escape, was that they were able to get a entry visa to a country. Now, this was all fiction. There were two students who were citizens of Holland. Holland was already taken over by Germany, so they could not go back to Holland. But what they did was they asked some diplomats from the Dutch, from Holland, if they could get a visa to go to, not to Holland per se in Europe, but to go to a island in South America of Venezuela, and that was Curacao. And the diplomat told these two citizens from Holland that, you know what, you don't need a visa to enter Curacao. All you have to do is, once you get there, you have to have permission from the governor to enter the island of Curacao. So they asked whether or not you could just give us a paper that says no visa is necessary to enter Curacao, and don't write down that permission has to be granted by the governor, which was very crucial because years later, the governor of Curacao was asked, would you have allowed these Jews to enter your country? And he said, absolutely not. So it was really a fiction in terms of getting a piece of paper which says you could enter this country. Once they had this paper saying that they are able to enter Curacao, so then they tried to get permission to travel through different countries to get to Curacao. Another fiction. They would have to get a travel permit from the Russians to go across all of Russia. They would have to get a travel permit from Japan to go through Japan to get to Curacao. Soroka or Haftig was a religious Zionist, and he was involved with rescue of Polish refugees. When he found out that some people were getting visas or permission to enter Curacao, he asked whether or not other people who were not citizens of Holland, would the diplomats be willing to give those individuals the same piece of paper. And fortunately, Dr. De Decker and others said, all right, we'll stamp everyone's papers, and we will not put down permission is necessary from the governor of Curacao. So this is a copy of my father's transit visa to travel through Japan to enter Curacao. The biggest problem was getting permission from the Russians to travel through Russia. Also getting permission from Japan to travel through Japan. To enable thousands of, hundreds of people to travel, they were fearful about asking the Russian government to be able to leave Lithuania and to leave the country and travel to Curacao. Fortunately, and historians are not sure why they allowed them. Some historians feel that the Lithuanians wanted to show that they were independent, or they wanted to obtain dollars from the refugees, but in any case, they gave permission to travel through Russia. But they also had to get permission to travel through Japan. That's where Sugihara came into the picture. He was a diplomat in Kovno. Now, countries have embassies for two purposes: to service people who are from their country in another country. If I am, for instance, an American and I have problems when I'm traveling in Israel, I go to my embassy. I go to the American embassy. All right. Japan had an embassy or an office in Kovno. There were no Japanese who lived in Kovno. It made no sense to have an embassy there. There was no commerce, no trade between Kovno and Japan. Yet there was this embassy where Sugihara was situated. Actually, he was a spy for the Japanese, and his primary responsibility was to monitor both German and Russian troops in the area. In any case, he was convinced that he was a Samari who had this belief in terms of helping people. But at the same token, he was also a diplomat of Japan. He really had to make sure that people could not come to Japan, which might be a burden to the Japanese government. But he felt an inner belief to save Jewry. As a matter of fact, this morning I met with Sally. This was a young boy who lived in Kovno, and he, in fact, met with Sugihara and invited him to a Hanukkah party by his parents, and to some extent, the affinity for Sugihara to the Jewish people was established by this encounter. Sugihara asked permission from his government to issue these travel permits through Japan. 3 times the request went through, it wasn't responded. The last time the Japanese government said no, do not issue any travel permits, but nonetheless he felt that these people, or these Jewish refugees, will be killed unless they receive these travel permits, and he issued them to anyone who was asking for them. 2 guys from Mirrer Yeshiva went to his offices in Kovno and helped him stamp literally several thousand permits, which said that this person is allowed to travel through Japan. Now it's interesting, when these permits were given, it was really a 10-day travel permit. We'll see that in Mirrer Yeshiva there were really about 1,500 people who overstayed their travel permit, and they were in Kobe, Japan for 6, 7, 8 months, and then they were sent to Shanghai. And again, Shanghai was controlled by the Japanese, and they were allowed to stay there for the duration of the war. And this is Sally Garner, who was, as a young boy, he was a 12-year-old boy when he met Sugihara. As a matter of fact, the Japanese foreign minister told Sugihara to stop issuing these permits, so these visas. Nonetheless, he did it anyway. The fact that Zerach or Haftig, who was later on became the head of the National Committee to save Polish Jewry, became a deputy, he became involved in the Knesset over here, He went and negotiated with the Russians and the Lithuanians to get these permits for the yeshiva, and unless they had this, they would not have been able to escape. In any case, there was those who even received these travel permits, the Curacao permits, and they were reluctant to ask permission to leave Russia because they felt they'll be sent to Siberia. Later on, those who didn't even get the Curacao permits tried later on to get them, but that window was closed, and unfortunately, they were left in Vilna or Kovno, and they never were able to leave. Interesting, when they were leaving, and they had to travel through all Russia and get to Moscow, in Tourist, which was the only travel agency allowed by the Russians, you needed some $200 in American dollars to pay for your ticket to travel. It was an issue which everybody was afraid, because they had to pay in American dollars, but it was against the law to have American dollars in Moscow. And there were some people who were pulled off the lines over there, and they were never heard from again. But Baruch Hashem, most of the people who, in fact, paid for their travel through Russia were able to get to Vladivostok. The Vat Solam, the Kudus HaRabbanim raised $97,000 to pay for the transport. My father's uncle sent money to enable him to have the monies to leave. So what we have is really everything coming together. Sugihara giving permits to leave, to travel to Japan, the Dutch Council, the British Council, who also enabled the paperwork to enable everyone to leave. Now they left from Moscow, they went all across Russia. This was a journey of 12 days until they came to the port of Vladivostok. Out of Vladivostok, there was a boat over there, and they traveled from there to Japan. It's been said that the last boat that left Vladivostok to Japan, after it transported the last refugees, that boat sank, and it did its job, and by saving those who traveled with them. The yeshiva itself, most of them stayed in Kobe, Japan for 6 months, but the Japanese knew that they were going to war, and after a while they said, we don't want any foreigners in our country, and they said, you have to leave, and they said, you have to go to Shanghai, China, which was also a chesed, because Japan controlled Shanghai, China, and they enabled everyone to go to China. As you know, most of the Mirrer Yeshiva stayed in Shanghai, China for the duration of the war. Things weren't so great. Many of the conditions were such that everyone never had enough food, but nonetheless, it was a haven for several thousand Jews who were in Shanghai, China. Now, my father never knew exactly what happened to his family. Would send postcards from Japan to communists, but by that time they were all killed. Those who did not have the ability to get all these papers, they were trapped in Lithuania, they were trapped in Poland, and unfortunately, when the Nazis and the Germans came into that area, they were all exterminated. In any case, my father was with the yeshiva in Shanghai, China, and like I said before, my father had an uncle in America who was able to get him finally his American visa. So he was with the yeshiva in China for about 6 months. He received his visa in the end of November of 1941. The first boat that he was able to leave Shanghai, China, was leaving on a Shabbos, and he did not want to travel on Shabbos and decided to go the following week. Interestingly, that boat that left on Shabbos was sunk later on its way to America. Nonetheless, he left on December 4th, 1941, which is crucial because, as you know, the date, get back here. December 7th, 1941 was a very important date because December 7th, 1941 was when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. My father was in a boat. Well, this is a picture of the yeshiva in Shanghai, China. That's my father. And he was with the yeshiva for those several months. But when he left, he had all the Bachram, they would sign their names. He wanted to make sure who was there, who was not there, never knowing if they would see each other later on. Now the question is, why did Japan, which was an ally to Germany, allow Jews to stay in Japan or to stay in Shanghai, China? It was appellate because they were allies with Germany. Back in 1904, there was a war between Russia and Japan. Japan needed to purchase ammunition, an army, and there was an American banker, Jacob Schiff, who was upset with Tsarist Russia because he saw Jews were being killed in pogroms. So he financed the war between Japan and Russia. And it's contended that the Japanese had a Karsa Tov to an American Jew for helping them back in 1904, and hence they also allowed the Jews to remain in Japan during parts of the war. There's another part of the puzzle that was very interesting. The Japanese had several people in their army who became the experts in Jews. And one of them, in fact, translated the particles of Zion in Japanese, which contended that Jews controlled the world. Because of that, propaganda by Russia, by Germany, was the Jews are trying to control the world, kill them out. The Japanese said, you know what, Jews have the ability to control the world, let's use their power and get them on our side. And they felt that if they would give haven to the if Japan would give haven to the Jews, then the Jews in America would feel beholden to Japan and lobby the American government to side with Japan. Nonetheless, Japan during this period, in fact, was instrumental in terms of saving Jews. There was an attempt by Germany. They sent some of their people to Japan, to Shanghai, China, and tried to convince the Japanese to kill out the Jews in Shanghai. There was a proposal to put all the Jews that were in Shanghai on boats, send them out, and sink the boat. That plan was revealed, and afterwards Japan just dropped their intentions if they were willing to side with the intents of the Nazi Germans. Well, my father was with the yeshiva in Shanghai, and what I just mentioned to you happened on Tisha B'Av, July 23rd, 1942, where the Nazis wanted to convince Japan to implement their own final solution, but Baruch Hashem, did not come to fruition. There was an encounter in terms of the Japanese. They wanted to know why Germany hates Jews so much, and there was a delegation with the Amsterdam Rebbe, and they were asked, why do the Germans hate you so much? And he said to them, well, you know what? Today the Germans hate us, but they also hate you folks, the Japanese, because you're Oriental, you're not Aryan like the Germans. And because of that, the Japanese said, don't worry, while you're here in Shanghai, China, you will not be harmed. So the yeshiva, Mirrer Yeshiva, stayed in Shanghai, China for the duration of the war. My father received a visa to come to America. Now, the Philippines, its story in terms of Jews was sort of checkered. The first Jews to come to the Philippines was in 1590. The Inquisition, unfortunately, caught up with the two Jews that were in the Philippines, and they were killed. And for the next few hundred years, there were no Jews in all of the Philippines. Well, that changed in 1898. There was a war. Most people don't realize it was a war between America and the Philippines. The Philippines lost, and war was really between Spain and America. And the Philippines became a commonwealth, became a territory of the American government. Because of that, after the war, Americans, there were several hundred Americans who lived in the Philippines. There was a small Jewish community in the Philippines. This was a shul that was built. And again, it was a shul that was certainly not Orthodox. They would have services only on Yom Kippur or Rosh Hashanah, but it was a very small secular Jewish community. Well, another crucial issue was that the Philippines, even though it was part of the United States, it was a territory of the United States, nonetheless, the immigration laws for the Philippines were not beholden to the immigration laws of America. Immigrations of America had quotas. Very few Jews or people could enter the United States, but the Philippines was free from those quotas. And since the president of Philippines, Manuel Quezon, he was friendly with the Freeler brothers. These were number of brothers, Jewish individuals who had a business in the Philippines. They were very friendly with even Eisenhower and MacArthur, and they tried to convince the president of the Philippines to open up the doors, open up the gates, and let Jews come to the Philippines, help populate the Philippines, bring more commerce to the Philippines, and he agreed. As a matter of fact, he was willing to allow 50,000 Jews to come to the Philippines. Unfortunately, the American State Department vetoed that, but nonetheless, there was a small period where some Jews were able to come to the Philippines. Most of the Jews who came to the Philippines during this period, there was maybe 1,500, 2,000 German and Austrian Jews who were able to come to the Philippines and in the late 1930s. Well, now that you had a presence of some larger Jewish community, in the Philippines. My father was supposed to leave, like I said, Shanghai to come to America. Because the war broke out on December 7th, and because when they bombed Pearl Harbor, they bombed Manila, my father got stuck in Manila. Now, it's very important to understand that the sneak attack of the Japanese on Pearl Harbor was devastating. 2,400 American soldiers were killed, but the Japanese never invaded the Hawaiian Islands, Pearl Harbor. There was an attack, people were killed, and that was the end of it. When they attacked Manila, the Philippines, tens of thousands of people were killed, and then shortly thereafter, the Japanese invaded and occupied the Philippines for the next almost 4 years. When they came to, when they first attacked Manila in December 7th, 1941, my father was on a boat in Manila Bay. Boat was bombed. Fortunately, he was able to get to shore. And like I said, there was a small Jewish community in Manila. There were a couple of from Jews as well in Manila. One of them was the Hirschouts. My father was able to go to them, get food, and spend Shabbos there. But 3 weeks later, the Japanese invaded the Philippines, and all foreigners, any people who are citizens of governments who were at war with Japan, were put into a prisoner of war camp. Now, it's very interesting that those German Jews who found some refuge in Manila, they were not put into prison because the Japanese didn't see them as Jews, they saw them as Germans. And Japan was allies with Germany. So there was a whole community of Jews who were not imprisoned, but the American Jews who were in Manila, who enabled those German Jews to come to Manila, they were put into these camps. My father, in fact, and two of his friends was with him, had no food, no money, and during this short period, the Hirschouts and other people from the Jewish community would send food to him in the prisoner of war camp. Interestingly, had my father remained in Shanghai under Japanese rule, he would not have been imprisoned. Here he was in Manila, and he was in fact put into a prisoner of war camp by the Japanese. The Japanese were relentless. The baton death march resulted in 10,000 Americans being killed. Another 20,000 were killed in prison camps. Just to give you an indication that things were not so good. In the beginning years, the governance of the prisoners were by Japanese who were civilians. Later on, the Japanese took out the civilian officials and replaced them with military officials who were relentless in terms of the prisoners. During this period, unfortunately, many people starved. They didn't give them any food. There was hunger. There was disease. My father had malaria, dysentery, very all life-threatening diseases, which unfortunately everybody in those camps were confronted with. Initially, they were sent to, they created the prisoner of war camp in St. Thomas internment camp. This was a Catholic university, but it had, it was situated within Manila itself. It had gates all around the university, and they converted this to a prisoner of war camp. Well, they had about 7,000 people who were in these camps, and then the Japanese said, we have to build another camp because we can't continue with more than what we have in Santo Thomas. So they set up another camp. Well, they said we're taking 80 people, we're sending them out into the boondocks, into the jungle, and they're going to build another camp for us, and that was Las Baños, where my father went. Now, I was able to find some documentation whereby my father and two other people who are makbid on kashrus went to the governing board of the camp. Japanese allowed the prisoners to develop their own governing board, and they asked him, could you give us the rice or the food that you have so we could cook it ourselves rather than it being cooked by the camp itself, which had tarfus? And they said, unfortunately not. And they had to subsist on some raw vegetables or trade whatever they had to get some food that they wouldn't have a problem kashrus. It's interesting that in these diaries it talks about the small group of extremely Orthodox Jews who had difficulty more so than everybody else. In essence, it kept the frum few Jews that were there segregated from the rest of the camp. What happened was there was an announcement one day. It was on Yom Kippur, 1942, where the announcement was that all these, and they named 40 people who have to come to a certain area. All those 40 people were all Jews. They were concerned that, well, they're separating the Jews from everybody else, and this was it. They're going to kill them. However, they were surprised because the commandant who summoned everybody to this one area said to them that, I know today is a holy day for you. Today is your Yom Kippur. We're going to let you folks get on a bus to go to Manila, 40 miles away, to go and go to your services in the shul, in the synagogue in Manila. First of all, they were relieved that they weren't going to be killed. Most of the people were secular Jews. They, in fact, took the invitation up and they got on buses and they went to the shul or the conservative synagogue in Manila. My father and several other people who were certainly Orthodox and religious, they refused to take the invitation. They found themselves a room in Santo Thomas University over there, a Catholic institution, and they had their own shul, and it's probably the first time in the history of that Catholic university where from Yom Kippur services were being held on the campus. Later on, that shul was destroyed by the Japanese. Bear in mind, that shul was on American territory. Manila, the Philippines, were American territory. So this was the only shul, only synagogue throughout the whole war, the only American shul or synagogue that was destroyed by the Japanese or by anybody during this period. Bear in mind also that when the Japanese invaded the Philippines, it was the very first time where territory from America was under the control of a foreign government, where thousands of Americans were in fact incarcerated and imprisoned by the Japanese. Well, we know that most everything that we do is governed by a calendar. We have to know what time Shabbos is. We have to know what time when the Tovim are, and these few from students were determined to be able to know when Shabbos and when or what Pasha was when the Yom Tovim were, and they created their own calendar. They were able to obtain an old calendar from Manila from a few years before that, and they constructed a calendar for the years that they were in prison. And this enabled them to keep Shabbos and Yontif to the best of their abilities. Reb Chaim Shmulevitz in Shanghai found out that these Bachrim were, in fact, not in America, that they were put in prison by the Japanese. He, in fact, tried to get the Japanese to send them back to Shanghai. And unfortunately, they were not, those pleas were not addressed by the Japanese. One of my father's friends, Mato Rabinowitz, was able to send a postcard. He said, I have a Kitzur Shulchan Aruch. He was alluding to the fact that we had no food, and he was pleading to Reb Chaim Shmulevitz to help us out. They were a small group. They had their Sidurim, Tefillin, they had some Sfarim with them, which kept them, alive during this period. Towards the end of the war, the Japanese were losing, and they were determined to kill all the prisoners. There was a plan to kill all prisoners at the Los Banos internment camp. There were 2,200 prisoners there. Till now, they were starving them to death, but they were determined to kill them. Right before that, since they were starving, what happened was the security around the camp wasn't that tight. The Americans would send people out at night to try to barter with the Filipino natives to bring food into the camp. There was one individual who went out one night. He was returning to the camp with a coconut or a vegetable or something, and the Japanese sentry saw him and shot him. He was just wounded. The Americans wanted to bring this person back into the camp, but the Japanese commandant went over to him, took a pistol and shot him in the head and killed him. This individual who was killed was in my father's barrack. After the war, when my father was liberated, there was testimony to the war commissions in terms of the Japanese, and my father never told me about this, but I went down to the National Archives in Washington and in College Point, Maryland, and I said, do you have any information about my father? And believe it or not, nothing's computerized. They come there and they said, well, we have something, but we don't know what it is. And they said, if you're willing to spend the time to go through all of our files, color covered, go to it. Anyway, they sent me bins of manila folders. The bins were about this size and this long. And they gave me about 6 of those bins. I spent 3 days there, and on my last day that I was there, I found one file. The file was my father's testimony that he saw and he knew of how they killed this American internee. And he gave testimony, and later on, in fact, this individual was found, and he was executed after the war. My father never told us about this. This was all new to me when I found out about it. And when I saw my father's handwriting in terms of his testimony, it blew me away. In any case, MacArthur was coming back to the Philippines. He said, I shall return. And they found out that the Japanese intended to kill out all the prisoners that were in the Los Banos camp. There was intelligence reports. Now you have to understand, there was a battle of Manila. There was a battle in terms of the Far East. The Americans were battling, the Japanese tooth and nail. To divert resources, to divert soldiers to a rescue effort made no military sense. Nonetheless, the Americans decided to go out and try to rescue the 2,200 people at Los Baños. The Battle of Manila was one of the fiercest in the entire Pacific. Tens and tens of thousands of people were killed during this period. About 1 million Filipinos were killed by the Japanese. The Japanese would just go and try to kill everyone and anyone they saw. As a matter of fact, even the Jewish community that was in Manila, that was not incarcerated, about 70 of those few hundred were killed during this period where the Japanese just wanted to kill everybody. In any case, they found out that the Japanese, every morning at 7 o'clock in the morning, they do calisthenics. And they left their guns on the side, and they would do these exercises. So what they decided to do, because they knew that there was going to be a massacre of everybody in the camp, they organized a team, 350 soldiers who were on amphibian tanks. They had parachuters who were on planes who dropped around the perimeter of the camp, killed out all the sentries, and they in fact saved the 2,200 people in the camp. All the prisoners were evacuated. No one was injured. There were 3 Americans and Filipino soldiers who were in fact killed during this operation. You have to understand, here was a camp. Just 8 miles away was the entire Japanese army. And they were able to go behind enemy lines and really rescue all these individuals. Well, that was the good news. It happened on as a matter of fact, when they came to rescue everybody in Los Baños, the inmates, the prisoners were confused. They didn't know what was happening. They were fearful, and the Americans had to torch all the barracks to force everyone out so they could rescue them, because the inmates didn't know what was happening. So a total of 2,146 interns were rescued, and unfortunately this Japanese Sadaki Kanishi escaped. Later on, he was caught up and they finally executed him. This is Karl Juravo, another person who was married to the sister of the wife of Reb Chaim Shmulevitz in Shanghai. He was an American who was working for a firm. He got caught in the Philippines. He went to Shanghai. I think it was the Amshina brother who read the shidduch between him and the sister of Chaim Shmulevitz's wife. She was pregnant. He sent her home, to his parents in New York. He remained in Shanghai. He got really one of the last ones to leave Shanghai, and while he was on his way back, he was caught in Manila, like my father and several others. So that's a picture of Karl Juravo, and you can see that he was certainly not getting a proper diet. After the liberations, there's a picture of my father and the 2 Rabinowitz brothers who were in fact saved. Now, most people are unaware of this rescue mission. It was the greatest rescue mission, successful rescue mission in the annals of American military history. What happened was, interestingly, at the same day was a victory, a partial victory of the Marines in Iwo Jima. And this famous picture of the flag on top of the Iwo Jima. This got all the publicity, but the publicity about this rescue of the 2,100 people at Los Banos was really downplayed. This Kanusha was hanged after a trial in 1947. So here you have a contingent of 2,100 people who were saved by the American authorities. There were maybe 40 or so Polish Jews who were part of the group. But in any case, what happened was my father wrote a letter to his uncle saying we're safe, and I hope to be coming back to America to you. And he sends this letter to them. The Americans put everybody on boats to come to the United States. All right, after they tried to, most of them were sick. After a few weeks, they were able to travel, and they put them on these boats to come to the United States. Well, unfortunately, during the same time, there was this major battle in Manila, and like I said before, some 67 Jews who were in the Manila community were killed. The shul was destroyed. There was some Sifrei terrorists that were taken by the, most of them were lost during this battle. There was one Sefer Torah that was saved, and later on it was used by the Americans when they used it on Yom Kippur and Pesach during the last year of the war. Well, what happened was my father's on a boat to come to the United States, all right, with his two friends. While they're on the high seas to come to the United States, another boat came next to their boat with officials, FBI, and they wanted to look at everyone's papers to make sure that they are citizens of America, that they should be allowed to come to the United States. And they asked my father, where could I see your papers? And he showed him their papers, and he said, well, you have a visa, but it's expired. My father says, I know it is expired because I was supposed to travel in December of 1941, and now it's April of 1945. I was in a prison. They said, well, we're sorry, but it expired, and they flew him off the boat and sent him back to Manila. There was a lot of paperwork between my father, his uncle, and the American officials. One individual, in fact, said that this was considered extenuating circumstances and he should be allowed to come to the United States. The Commission of Immigration, unfortunately, his own parents who are immigrants, who should have had the sensitivity in terms of immigrants who were trying to get to the United States, vetoed this, said no, his visa is invalid and he can't come to the United States. He has to reapply. Fortunately for my father's friends, the Rabinowitzes, somehow they were not caught. They were on the boat and they came to the United States. My father, unfortunately, was without his friends. The Jewish community in Manila was destroyed. He had no money, he had nowhere to go. He was able to get employment by the U.S. Army during that next year, where he and his uncle was trying to get new papers to allow him to come to the United States. So here he was stranded, but fortunately, after he was given some papers by the U.S. Army. The U.S. Army was the governing body of Manila during the war there. And the colonel said, you have a visa, here's, get on the boat and go. When he came back, the colonel said, why are you back? And he said, well, they threw me off. And he said, but you have a real visa, you really should be allowed to, but unfortunately it was vetoed by the Commission of Immigration. Which goes to show you how the State Department and officials within the American government were not sensitive to the plight of Jews who were trying to save themselves in coming to the United States. Well, Finally, he applied again, and you have to understand that he was frustrated because every time papers were submitted to the State Department, they were lost. New regulations came in. They demanded things to be written in triplicate. They demanded that one of the things that was a major obstacle of many refugees in Europe is if they, the Americans asked, do you have any relatives who are still in Poland or in Russia? And if they said yes, they would refuse to give them any approvals, because they said, well, if you come to America and you still have family in Europe, then the Germans are going to try to exert pressure on you, saying that to make you a spy, otherwise we're going to kill your family. The truth is, that the families were killed anyway beforehand. But nonetheless, my father had to stay in Manila for another year until his new American visa was approved. You know, before he had two chaverim who were with him in Manila. He had a Jewish community in Manila. This last year he was really by himself. Nonetheless, he had Amunah, and he had been talking that he'll eventually come to the United States. His visa was finally approved, and letters that he sends to his uncle shows the desperation he has, that, I don't know what's going to happen with me. I just hope that I'm able to come to America. Throughout this ordeal, throughout this almost 5 years, where he was trying to leave from Mirrer through Kobe, Japan, to Shanghai, to Manila, he was always one step ahead of the Malachimovis, and he saw every single day persecution and many people who were killed during this his journey. 3 years later, finally he comes to America. This is Avram Kamenovitz. That's the one on the right is my father's uncle, Max Simkowitz. This is my mother over here. Finally, he came to America, married. As a matter of fact, Rabbi Rabinowitz was the father of the two other Bachrim, who was at the Chassan as well. My father finally founded Yeshua. Baruch Hashem, my father married. He had 4 children. From his children, both my brothers and sister, as well as myself, there are the fruits of his labors. All of my children are in the yeshivas and kollels. They're all in Klei Kodesh. They're in kollels in Cincinnati, St. Louis, here in Yerushalayim. And it is to my father's credit that he was able to bring up a mishpacha where everyone, Baruch Hashem, is Shem Torah mitzvahs. And we have a curse tov to HaKadosh Baruch Hu that enabled my father to survive, and we are here to talk about this story today.
Just go ahead.
Wow, it was, there are no words. Riveting, I don't know, you accept the knowledge of the Mirrer, of your father's incredible story. It's just unbelievable. So this is the book. So B'ezras Hashem, it will be reprinted, and I really recommend everybody to get a copy. It really is something out of this world. It's extraordinary. Can we take questions? Sure. If there's any questions from the audience or comments.
When your father finally came to America, he was right away ready to be regular, get married, and need like time to just get normal.
It's interesting. The entire Mirrer Yeshiva in Shanghai was Makanahim. They felt that he was going to be here, 4 years before them. Ultimately, he came a year after everyone from Shanghai who went to either Eretz Yisrael or to America. You know, my father never talked about his experiences. In a way, maybe he wanted to shield us. Maybe it was his way of dealing with it. Even to my mother, he revealed very little. When he first came to America, he tried to be a sheikhet, but he was a lefty, so when you have when the chickens or the behemoths would go on the assembly line, it was not conducive for a lefty, so he could not be a sheikhet. Then he worked for his uncle in the furrier line for a while, but my father was colorblind, so that didn't help him in that regard. Ultimately, he worked, there was Ruchim Levovitz, the mashgiach from Mirrer Yeshiva, had a son, Moshe Leib Levovitz. My father worked with Moshe Leib Levovitz in Mozon, in Borough Park, first in Crown Heights, then in Borough Park, for many, many, many years. Moshe Leib Levovitz left, was also with the yeshiva. He was in Kobe, Japan, and he got papers to come to America before the war. His wife, Rivka, was pregnant, and they were told that if the Japanese find out that she's pregnant, she was very, very pregnant, they would not allow her on a ship. So she put on a big coat and didn't let them know that she was pregnant. Their first son, Yeruchim Levovitz, was born on a Japanese boat. Now, according to international law, if you are born on a ship of a country, you have citizenship of that country. They refused to give him citizenship of Japan. And he showed me, as a matter of fact, Yeruchim Levovitz taught me how to lane, and he taught me my pshata when I was bar mitzvah. He showed me his birth certificate from the Japanese. It doesn't say he was born on the boat. It just gives the latitude and longitude of the ocean where he was born on the high seas. So my father worked for Muslim for many, many years. My father lived in Borough Park. He was one of the founders of the Mirrer Minyan in Borough Park. As a matter of fact, I sat on the laps of the Mirrer Minyan was comprised of mostly the yeshiva boys from Mirrer Yeshiva, the Mirrer Minyan. I sat on all the laps when I was a kid. And the truth is, we, my contemporaries, did not realize who we were sitting with. We didn't understand what they went through. We didn't understand that, you know, if you take a look at American Jewry, in terms of the yeshivas, the Rosh Yeshivas, they all came from the remnants of Mirrer Yeshiva who were saved, both here in Eretz Yisrael as well as in America. And Baruch Hashem, you know, when you know, in times of the Gemara, when they said Yavna, give me Yavna, save Yavna, and it's Talmidim rather than, you know, saving the base of English. So in a way, Kadosh Baruch Hu saved the yeshiva in its entirety, and they all went different cities and countries, and Torah was flourishing as a result of that. I learned in Mirrer Yeshiva in Brooklyn. Shmuel Birnbaum, who was a good friend of my father's, who's my Rosh Yeshiva. My brothers, I was there from 1964 to 71. My brothers learned in Mirrer Yeshiva here in Yerushalayim as well. So
I was in Yeshiva also, 74 to 77.
So Mirrer Yeshiva is in my blood. What can I tell you? Thank you all for coming. I know it was late. I'm sorry if I went through things very quickly.
It was amazing. Really a big issue.